very special opportunity today. And as I think all of you recognize after having read Night, you know, the Holocaust was an incredible and powerful part of our history that, although it was a very evil part, can provide us with tremendous lessons. And those most important lessons come from the personal perspective that you're going to hear about today. And I know as we've been talking about it, and I shared with you so that you could read last night Mr. Feiger's story, I hope you had a chance to look it over and kind of take it in a little bit and think about it in relation to what we've been talking about and into our reading of Night. This is a very rare opportunity, and certainly I hope you recognize it for what it is and appreciate the time and the emotion and the power that comes with having to tell this story. So let me go ahead and introduce our guest, Mr. Walter Feiger, and thank you, Walter, for coming to visit us.
Well, hello, students of Emily Gray. I'm very happy to be here. Are you happy to be here?
Yes.
Well, that's wonderful. So, since maybe some of you read my story, we are like old friends now. I know who you are, or you know who you are, and I know who I am. So I'm going to go tell you that when it all started. Before it all started, I was a young man just like you. Not women, men. Two of your students are here, my grandkids. Mike and Alana Masunas are my grandchildren. And I'm honored that they are here to listen to my story today. It's very emotional to me, because I was almost Mike's age when I was taken to camp. But before that, I had a quite normal life. If you don't mind, I take my jacket, so it's getting a little warm in here. I went to a nice school. I had good friends. I was growing up in a privileged family. My father was a chemist. We owned a little factory that was producing household cleaning products. And as a student, I had a card. Every student had a card that could go to something comparable to the YMCA. I used to love to go swimming there. Where I grew up, there was no ocean, so pools were very nice. I belonged to a school hockey team, and I was growing up just like you kids are growing up today. And then, of course, the war started, and that all ended. The city that we lived was Germany before World War I. Jews were no longer allowed to live there. So we had to move into a smaller town, which they created a ghetto. A ghetto was an area where Jews lived, and they could not leave the area. Some ghettos, bigger ghettos, were walled. The one I was in was not, but it had a designated area. So many square blocks were Jews, and you couldn't get out of there unless you have special papers issued by the German authorities. If you were found that you did go out, immediately would send to Germany and to a concentration camp. Now, I was in that ghetto for about approximately 2 years before I was sent. Every young man aged 12, and this is when the war started, I was 12 years old, had to have an occupation. So my parents they had a friend that was a roofer, and they asked him if he would mind to take me in as an apprentice. Well, that was a very short career, because when I got on the roof, I decided I don't like heights. And that wasn't something I wanted to do. I was really scared. So that was a very short career. And my next step was then my mother enrolled me into a special group. They called it Sonderkommando. We used to do canalization and highway work. We would leave the ghetto Monday morning, come back Friday night. We lived in a barracks. There were no guards, because we were supposed to be all volunteers working for the German government. My older brother, I had one brother that was 3 years older. When the ghetto started, there was a decree issued by the German government that every family has to supply a male aged 17 or older to go to work to Germany. They called it volunteer work, but it wasn't volunteer work because you had to supply somebody. So my older brother was sent to forced labor camp at the age of 17. Now, by the time I was getting Michael's age, working at this commando group that my mother hoped I was able to escape being sent to Germany, because they gave us documents showing that we were working for the German government. One day coming back from, while weekends we were in the ghetto. One weekend on a Sunday we were all summoned to a local gymnasium. A local gymnasium is equivalent to a high school. There was supposed to be a briefing we all needed to attend. While we were there, the building was surrendered by the SS group, which is an elite German detail dealing especially with Jews. And we stood in front of we had to undress, stood in front of a German doctor and an other official. And the doctor said, he's strong. I was built a little bit like Mike. I wasn't as tall as Mike, but I was husky. And the official said, well, he's not 17, because that was the age to send to Germany. But the doctor said, no, he's okay. So they marched us to the railroad station. My mother was able to pass on a small suitcase with some belongings, some German money in it. She was able to do that because my mother was German. She had some connection with the German police officers. And we marched to the station. From there, we were taken to a transitional camp. A transitional camp was still in Poland. And I went to see one of the officials. They called them kapos. And I says, listen, I have some German money. I have a brother that is in Sachau, Germany. If you can send me there with a transport, I'll give you all the German money I have. And I was very lucky, because a couple of weeks later, there was a transport going to Sachau, Germany, and I was sent there. And I can see today the expression of my brother's face. Here comes his kid brother at the age of 15. I was 3 months short to be 15. Now, the benefit to have worked in that special commando group prior, that I learned how to use a shovel. The German masters that were in charge of highway work were very peculiar how you use the shovel. If you move the dirt from one place to another, it should turn over without dispersing. If you were able to do that, they kind of respected you, because normally Jews did not use shovels. Why didn't they use shovels? Well, 1,000 years ago, when the Jewish kings invited the Jews to come to Poland, was because the Polish nation was a people that worked the land, and they needed commerce. That's why they invited the Jews. But they were not allowed to use land. They could not buy land. So they never used shovels. They were trade people, but they never used shovels. Now, when somebody came and worked and they didn't like that the way they did use the shovel, the beating started. Now, the Germans specialized in three things. They had a manual. Number one was torture. Number two was starvation. Number three was humiliation. This is a very tough combination. Now, I spent in the camps, the first 2 years were forced labor camps. We wear our civilian clothing, but we had stars, yellow stars set in Jew. After the 2 years, in the first 2 years in the camps were just Jews only. One day coming back from work, there was a spread rumor that the camp is going to be liquidated. And that's when the transition came from forced labor camp to concentration camp. Now, in the forced labor camp, there were barbed wires. The guards were former soldiers from World War I. They didn't look very threatening. The barracks were like for 60 people, a stove in the middle. Most of the time I spent in Bavaria. Winters are very cold, but we still had our own clothing at the time. Now the transition from the forced labor camp to the camp that was called KZ-Lager, concentration camp, was not very smooth. It was winter time, it was snowing. We stood in front of a German commission again. We had to undress. They looked us over, and one of the German officials with a cane would say, "You go to the left, you go to the right." Well, we didn't know exactly what that meant. But if you were selected to go to the right, that means you were selected to go to the concentration camp. If you were selected to the left, you went to Auschwitz. Auschwitz were the ovens. That's where you were cremated, and that was the end of you. Now, why do we call it the Holocaust? Any of you have any idea why do we call it the Holocaust? We call it the Holocaust because 6 million Jews were killed, murdered. They didn't die, they were murdered. And that's why we call it the Holocaust. Now, the condition in the forced labor camp were tough, but you could survive. Now, I brought with me to show you a portion of bread which was my daily ration. So pass it around, check it out, see the amount. This is what you were given, and on this amount of bread, you had to survive. You got in the morning, you got this amount of bread with an imitation cup of coffee. When you came back at night after work, you got a bowl of diluted soup, mostly cabbage and potato peels. People did not survive very long, because if you were subject to beating and starvation, it was very difficult. And then, of course, there was all kinds of sickness going on. There were no doctors to treat you. So every day you woke up and you saw some of the people were dead. They couldn't take it. How I survived 3.5 years, I don't know. I was lucky. Now I had something going for me because my mother was German, my father was Austrian. The first language I spoke was German. So I understood the language. I was young. I was strong. If the German masters tell you something to do, and they assumed that every Jew understood German, but if you didn't understand, that's when the beating started. If you are subject to torture, and if you are subject to starvation, your chances of survival were very small. And that's why so many Jews have perished. I was one of the lucky ones. Now, going into the concentration camp was wintertime, like I said. There was an SS officer in front of the group, one in the back. 50 of us at the time would march. And wasn't too far, about 6 kilometers. Now, I knew about concentration camp because sometimes I saw some people going through in a wagon with stripes. That's how I knew that it was there. They were from the concentration camp. The greeting that we had once we got into the concentration camp, my impression, there were double wires. There were wires in front, wires in between, and wires in the back. They were stationed every few hundred yards with machine guns. Germans, officers with dogs. I had like a sudden feeling, a pain in my stomach that this is probably the end. And sinister voices we got into the camp itself. One of the capos, and capos were those normally that were in charge of the prisoners, stood on the table and said, "Well, welcome your SOBs. I give you 6 months to live." There were 2,000 of us. 6 months later, there are 500 left. Through torture, through starvation, to different illnesses. So the difference between the concentration camp and the forced labor camp, in the concentration camp it was multinational. There were Jews, there were gypsies, there were Jehovah's Witnesses, there were some priests, French, Italian, multinational, Czechoslovakians. And the barracks were 600 men to a barrack, no women, just men. And in the forced labor camp there were some Jewish women. So here there were 600 Jews into this particular barrack. Now, every once in a while they had an inspection. Middle of the night, the coppers would come in. There were bunk beds. There were no mattresses, just straw. A bag filled with straw. This is what you laid on. And if they found straw underneath your bunk bed, you got 50 lashes. Now, it was very difficult to avoid not having straw because there were no mattresses. Then there were curfew. 9 o'clock you couldn't leave the barracks. So if you had to go to the bathroom, they had a big pot out in front by the entrance. And this is where you had to urinate. And there was one man that was responsible to make sure that you do not urinate outside. And if they inspected and they found there was urine outside, he got 50 lashes. Those lashes were usually an iron bar covered with leather. I was one subject to 50 lashes. I couldn't sit down for 3 weeks because my skin was broken through the lashes. But I wouldn't go to the infirmary because in the infirmary, I heard rumors that once you go in, you never go out because the SS would make a surprise visit and everybody was taken out and taken to the ovens. So one time I had an injury on my bottom, my foot, and it was lathered with pus, and I had a piece of glass, and I did my own operation, so I shouldn't go to the infirmary. And this is how I survived. We had wooden shoes. With the wooden shoes that deformed your feet, that later on I had problem finding shoes that would fit. But that was not the worst of it. The worst of it was starvation. That was the greatest punishment. So now you see how can you survive on so little bit of bread. Now you were hoping when you get your bread ration in the morning that it was not fresh bread. Because if it was fresh, 2 bites and it was going. So I was hoping it's going to be a little stale. Now, I used to fantasize when I was in the camp that someday, God willing, I'd be able to sit down to a loaf of bread all by myself. Nobody to share it with. This is how starvation works on you. You cannot concentrate because you're being humiliated, one thing, and you're starving. And you have to avoid torture. So I pretended that I was invisible. Well, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work, but I had to have something to hold on to. And so there were now the concentration camps. They had kapos. Their job was to kill people. If they didn't like the way you looked, they beat you up. And once you got a severe beating, your survival chances were very slim. After being in a concentration camp for about a year, I had a German master. He happens to be a communist. He was not a Nazi, and he would tell me the cannons were going out close by. You could hear the cannons, and he would say, "Walter, the Russians are coming. The Russians are coming." So one day, we were ordered to evacuate. So everybody had to get ready to evacuate. The guards that were in charge of the evacuation were Ukrainian SS officers. They didn't speak any German, but they hated Jews with a passion. Just to clean the rifle, they would shoot the Jew. This is how they ate it. Now, they were German allies because they didn't like the Russians, because they were occupied the Russians. So when the Germans invaded, they became allies of the Germans, and they were terrible, terrible people at the time. So now the evacuation starts. It's winter time, and you had no clothing because the stripes looked like a pajama, but it wasn't soft like a pajama, and it's below zero. And people were just falling down and down. If you fall down, you just got shot. We would spend nights, in horse stalls. And they had horse lice. We used to call them the Crusader, the Kreuzers, because they actually had a cross on their back. They were huge. And they were deadly. My brother got typhus because he got bitten by them. And when you get typhus, you get dehydrated. All you want is water. You no longer care for food. And about 6 weeks before the liberation, he passed away in my arms. He was nothing but skin and bones when he died. So now I felt desperate because through 3.5 years we worked together. And suddenly the only person that I could cling to, because he was older, more experienced, died. At that time I didn't care anymore if I'm going to live or die. I was ready to die, but I couldn't die. I wanted to die. And then one day, the guards were going. And what happened here? And a group of Russian soldiers came into the camp and he said, "You are free, you're liberated." They gave us a piece of paper that you were in the camps, and that was it. What do you do now? Where do you go? How do you survive? I walked out of the camp. I could barely walk because by now I was no longer looking like Mike. I was just skin, bones and skin. You could see my ribs. There was nothing there. And I started, a German came to see me and started talking to me. Well, I conversed well in German at that time. So he invited me to his home. And he said, I'll take care of you. And the reason he did that, because the Germans were now occupied by the Russians, and they feared the Russians something terrible, because they knew the atrocities that the Germans have done to the Russian people when they occupied part of Russia. So I was like a security blanket for having a prisoner being taken care of. And he was right, because one day a Russian officer came in to the house, and I learned some Russian because in the camp there were Russians, and so multi-nation, you learn some of the languages. I learned some Russian. And he said to me, I want to speak to everyone in this house over here. And so you went upstairs, he says, you send me one by one up there. And then he said, this woman here, she goes up last. She was 17 years old, and he raped her. That was the purpose of the inspection. He didn't want it to interrogate, he just wanted to rape the woman. And he was able to do that legally. Now, my experience with the Russians were, this German, he was working for high-ranking German officers. And he had some things that he said, I can give you. He gave me some of the nice clothing. There was a bike. And so he gave me those things. And I was riding the bike, and one day a group of Russian officers stopped and he says, show me your papers.